Hey folks, in this video I'm going to go over the frequency distribution theory, the kind of theory behind it in music in general, and how it applies to GetSpectrumData and GetSpectrumDataHelper. So GetSpectrumDataHelper has been set up so that it's going to grab from the return of GetSpectrumData, and that's going to return whatever sample count you set it to. So if you set it to 8,192, it's going to pick the appropriate 128 values from this array that'll be returned, and it'll pick them such that they match these frequencies here. So it'll start at an octave below. This is your kind of classical piano or keyboard, full-size keyboard, and so it'll start an octave below and kind of end a couple octaves or more above, and that's going to cover a lot of the frequencies we hear in music, and also a lot of kind of the human hearing range. And it's a number, obviously there's usage to get more detail between these notes, but for the purposes of audio visualization and being creative, I decided on this kind of range and this number, because that's kind of something that's more easily digestible and that you can start being creative with. These frequencies match these notes. It's what you picture when you picture a range of audio and frequencies. You picture a keyboard more so than a scientific range of data. And so hopefully you can just take those 128 values and start doing cool stuff with them. And then I just want to go over some of the cool and interesting stuff with how we hear frequency, how it behaves. Something to note here, I've written it, every time you go up an octave on a keyboard, right, A0, A1, A2, A3, it's a repeating pattern. Every time you go up an octave, you're doubling in frequency. So it's an exponential rise in frequency. And I've graphed this here so you can get a sense of what that means. Every time we go up one octave, we're doubling the amount of frequency, right? And why is that interesting and relevant? Well, the amount of frequency range between A6 and A7 is almost 2,000 hertz, and the amount of range of frequency between A0 and A1 is less than 20 hertz. And that's kind of interesting, because if you played a melody up here and then you played the same melody down here, the relative distance between the notes sounds the same to your ear, even though the actual measurement in the speed of vibration is quite drastically higher in this range than in this range. And that becomes relevant when we're processing what GetSpectrumData returns, and we'll use this graph here to kind of visualize that. We've got and just a single axis of hertz incrementing linearly 500. We've got notches at every 500 more, and then so I've graphed. So if we were to graph all those A notes across this, right? Just like we saw in this graph, the distance between them is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Because we're always doubling. So that's how our octaves, our sort of musical frequency, is distributed. But then these lines you're seeing here above, these notches, these are the frequency bins, or the sample, the increments of frequency that GetSpectrumData is going to process, Unity's native function. And so I've got this controlled here. This is how they'd be split up if you did 256 samples. If you did, say, like a common one people do, 512. So this is where things get interesting. If you do 512 samples, right, you split up your your output range 512 times, you end up with more than enough samples in this higher range, right? A6 to A7. There's only 12, that your ear will will kind of like discern. There's only like 12 notes in an octave, right? That your ear's probably looking for, like, visually, if you're visualizing something. So more than enough accuracy there. We have way more than 12 samples. But then as we go lower and lower here, this octave, okay, already A4 and A5, we have less than 12. And when we get down to these, like, where these octaves where you'd hear bass lines, definitely not enough. So these two lower octaves barely have 1 or 1.5 samples. So even though we have 12, your ear can hear, 12, can hear a melody being played down here. It doesn't just hear two big fat notes. But that's all you'll get with 512 samples. And so that's why because that's how, the hertz are being split up kind of linearly, but we hear logarithmically, right? This kind of exponential relationship, or you could say logarithmic. That's why you end up having to get, that's why it's worthwhile to go, you might be thinking, well, there's only 88 keys on the piano. Why the heck do I need, 2,048 freaking samples? Why don't I just do 64? Well, at 64, you might get, or let's say you say 128, maybe that's, 256, let's say 256. You might get enough data here, but you're really not going to get much accuracy in these lower ranges. And maybe that's okay for what you're visualizing, but in any case, I tend to go around, the range I tend to operate in is I'll do 1024. I've noticed is pretty responsive. So that's a good number if you want your audio visualization. Want to make sure your audio visualization is pretty snappy and reactive on maybe a not so performant machine. You'll have decent accuracy up till starting in that third A3 octave. So starting kind of in the middle of the keyboard, and lower than that, it'll be not super accurate, but you'll get, visually it'll still sound kind of cool, like bass kicks, and big bassy sounds will just kind of make big pops down, big visual forms down here. But not super accurate. If you go 2048 is kind of your good middle ground. You're still going to get decent accuracy down here, just not in the lower two octaves. 4096, you'll be able to visualize if you've got this like intricate bass line being played. You'll be able to visualize most of it, but still not that lower octave, still not quite. And if you really have like a bass line that's like super intricate and you need that visualized, then you got to go up to 8,192. And so that'll be all these are showing, again, the amount of samples that GetSpectrumData will be returning, and GetSpectrumDataHelper, our script is always gonna grab 128, relevant frequencies from this big huge return, and make it easier to work with. So hopefully that was helpful, and it'll help you get a sense of, okay, which sample count should I pick, and then understanding why you've always got 128 return values from this script from GetSpectrumDataHelper to work with. Thanks for watching.